So welcome everyone to ICALA and tonight's program, our POV tour with Scientia Sexualis. Scientia Sexualis is an ambitious group survey of contemporary artists whose work takes up the fraught relationship between sex, gender, and science. Organized by Jennifer Doyle, Professor of English, University of California, Riverside, UC Riverside, and Jeanne Vaccaro, Assistant Professor of Transgender Studies and Museum Studies, University of Kansas. The exhibition is realized as part of Pacific Standard Time, an ambitious collaboration across arts institutions throughout Southern California, and is led by the Getty. This is my very quick introduction because we have Jeanne and Jennifer here who will give you a more elaborate introduction to the show. And thanks to a convergence of ideas and schedules, we have two guest speakers for tonight for this POV tour who will be joined by Jeanne and Jennifer for the tour. We have Amber Jamilla Musser, who's Professor of English and Africana Studies at the CUNY Graduate Center and the author of Sensational Flesh, Race, Power, and Masochism. Also, Sensual Excess, Queer Femininity, and Brown Jouissance. And Between Shadows and Noise, Sensation, Situatedness, and the Undisciplined. Amber wrote the essay, Fragmentation, Commodification, and Autonomy, Varieties of Gynecological Representation for the Scientia Sexualis catalogue, which is for sale. I see some of you holding them. Yes, thank you for purchasing. They are available for purchase. And the essay touches on the works of several artists in the show addressing these themes, such as Colleen Smith, Zandra Ibarra, Candice Lynn, Now Bustamante, and we're hearing it now, El Palomar. And King Cobra, documented as Doreen Lynette Garner, is a sculptor and performance artist whose practice confronts colonial histories of violence. And I could read more of their bio, but you will have the wonderful opportunity to hear from Cobra about the dimensions, research, materiality with the pieces in the show. So let's begin with Jeanne and Jennifer giving us an overview and revealing some of the process behind involving the brilliance of the artists, the writers, the community, and then move on to hearing from our guest speakers, Amber and Cobra. Why don't we come over here because we have the cameras over here too. Yeah, don't hide.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Thanks. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Okay, I'm Jeanne.
I'm Jennifer.
Oh, you got a mic, okay. So we're really so honored to have Amber and Cobra not only here tonight, but as really incredible participants in this exhibition and the catalog as an artist in the exhibition. And so we want to mostly just have a chance to engage with them and hear about the process and also engage with you. Like this is very much a space for dialogue, conversation, questions. And so maybe we can just say a little something about, Amber wrote a wonderful essay for the catalog, but was also part of our kind of curatorial advisory committee. And so we met, was it 2 years ago? A year and a half ago? But we were in conversation kind of throughout, and we really leaned on our catalog contributors like Amber to kind of think about the development of the exhibition. So there were works that arrived because of those conversations and some works that didn't make it because of those conversations, but the kind of scholarly conversations were so important to the development of the show. It really has been a very collective effort. And we also had a chance to work with Cobra on a studio visit and kind of throughout. And Cobra's practice, of which there are 3 works in the show, but it's a really expansive and incredible practice, was also really integral to our thinking. And so we're very much indebted to both of you for all that you've given to help us shape the show beyond just, your work and your work, but this incredible dialogue with artists that, I don't know, how many people have already been here to see the exhibition? Okay, cool. That's helpful. Great.
Okay.
Yeah.
I guess I'll say a little bit about the gynecological. Cobra and I were talking a little bit about this. Well, I was sharing a little bit last night about where did the idea for the show where did it first start? And for me personally, it first started with learning about Cobra's work. and at the same time, now Bustamante, who also has work in this show and work at Track 16, was turning to the scene of the pelvic exam, and kind of coming at the project of confronting the pelvic exam and its hauntings with really different tactics, and producing really different kinds of work. And I found myself thinking about what would it be like to have work by these artists near each other, and is that even possible? And that's actually, so yeah, so it's really exciting to have Cobra here, and I'm a little starstruck, but also because Cobra's work has been, I'd say, like increasingly central for people who are thinking the question of like Black feminist aesthetics, ethical questions around working with really deep cuts, lasting wounds, and then there's something else happening in Cobra's work where there's some I think about like Paul Tech, the artist Paul Tech, a lot when I'm looking at your work, which is there's something really hot about the work, really sexy and really dark, all at the same time. And that was a bar for us, I think, across the show, is that ability to kind of stay in a space where like the sexual being is there very much alive in really impossible places. And so Cobra, your work has been a really important model for thinking and understanding what work like that can look like. So that's all I want to say, and so I just want to hear from the two of you and begin our conversation with the show. Yeah? Okay, yeah?
Yes, thank you guys. So I'm gonna start by giving a little brief, because then I think we're gonna start by looking at Cobra's work. And so it would be better to be there when that happens. So my background is, can you hear me? Is okay. My background is in history of science. So I've been thinking around questions of Scientia, Sexualis for basically my entire scholarly formation. So I was very excited about the show because one of the central questions that I think it asks is really about what kind of dialogue is happening between patients and medicine. And so we have these questions around capture, but also questions of escape. So when I was thinking a lot about what kind of essay I would want to write around this, I was thinking a lot about the way the gynecological image has kind of shaped a lot of what we consider to be the perspective of Scientia Sexualis and sort of sexuality more broadly. And so I was really enticed, I guess I would say, if we're going to stick with the sexual, of the the spread legs, and sort of thinking a lot around the ways that that's been deployed, but also the way that that could be a source of agency and sort of resignification for people. But really, I'm very interested, and this is kind of where Cobra's work especially comes in thinking about the possibilities of enfleshment, and sort of where the body doesn't quite get captured by these particular types of visual aesthetics that are also part of larger scientific projects. So that's kind of where I'm coming from with this tour.
Well, I have a lot to offer as far as the process that happens behind the scenes. I think, this show, it encapsulates a lot of history about gynecological practices and traumas that especially Black women experience in the medical industry. And so today I'm kind of here to talk about some of my process and some of the experiences that I've had while making some of these works, especially say for instance, Fuck Baloney has a very long story behind it, and there's actually another piece that goes along with it. So I'm hoping to just give you guys some extra information, and also just give a couple other injections to the pulse that already exists in the work.
Why don't we start with this piece?
This is vesicovaginal fistula. This is a piece that I created in 2016, and this was at the very beginning of me doing experiments with silicone. In 2015, I visited the library that's across the street from where this J. Marion Sims statue was. And when I was there, I was able to look at his journal entries, which were pretty explicit and disgusting and exploitative.
And we should back up in case people don't know who J. Marion Sims is. So, do you? Okay.
Yeah.
So he is described as the father of gynecology because he developed the speculum, but he performed his research on enslaved women, many of whom were suffering from this particular condition.
Vesicovaginal fistula.
Yes, which happens after, when muscles are weak after childbirth, there sort of becomes a whole, yeah, I don't know.
Okay, so basically, sometimes during childbirth, the child's head can start to cause friction in the tissue, and it can rip a hole. Sometimes, urethra, vaginal canal, and then also your bowels. So a lot of bodily fluids can mix together, which causes a lot of bacterial infection. And a lot of times it ended up being a fatal complication in childbirth.
So Sims was operating on enslaved women who had this condition because they were sort of, once you have this, you're pretty much debilitated. And he was operating on them without anesthesia many times. They were helping each other as nursemaids. And then sort of out of that, he developed the speculum, but then also did develop a corrective surgery. And for that, he gained fame and then left, I think he was left the South and went to, I think both New York and Europe, and sort of became like the gynecologist for like wealthy white women. So often this history is submerged.
So yeah, they kind of like, love him in New York. So they have a lot of his texts at the library across the street from his where his statue was, and so I ended up finding out, just his perspectives on the Black body, and they were really disgusting. But then I also had this moment when I left the library and went across the street to see the statue, and the plinth that he stands up on came about here. And so I was only able to touch his feet. So it makes it so that anyone that wanted to, enact rage on the statue is impossible unless you were to like throw something. So that made me more interested in figuring out ways to get revenge against him and his legacy. So once I started doing my research, I started looking at what the actual procedure looks like internally and through drawings. So this was a piece that I ended up creating for Volta Art Fair that was curated by Derek Adams. And some of the concepts I was working through with this piece is like, how like magicians will do this trick where they stab knives through the box and somehow, the woman comes out unscathed. So it kind of lent itself to this idea that like, oh yeah, I've been doing these procedures on these women and they're totally fine. And no, they're not traumatized. I'm not torturing them. They're totally great. And so through these procedures, he would oftentimes get them drunk, blacked out on whiskey. They would be screaming in horror and, forced to hold each other down. He would be doing these sutures that would also get infected. So he would have to cut tissue and reopen and then suture it again. And so one person, for example, Anarka, she ended up experiencing over 30 procedures over the course of 5 years without anesthesia. And I think that those procedures started when she was 15. So I wanted to create a piece that reflected how many procedures were actually done. So I made this silicone sculpture, which is basically like a recreation of the procedure as a sculpture, but then since it's turned away from us, you're actually presented with the reflection of yourself, and also because it's in an infinity box, there's kind of like a countless reflection. So this was the first piece that I created referencing this history. And, you know, it was really different because I was so used to working with glass, which is a hard material. And so it forced me to think about the body in different ways, and also kind of like the temporality or the fragility of the skin. And so, you know, it's just like a starter piece, kind of like an entry point to just like explorations that I've been doing with the body.
I think it's really interesting, the mirror. I love the layer of complicity that you're inviting the audience or the viewers into, and also the question of legacy, right? Which I think maybe will bring us to the other piece. I mean, not to cut off if other people have questions or comments.
Yeah, do you have questions? Yeah.
But I wanted to ask you about, because I was also thinking about, I think what Jennifer said, making the reference to Paul Tech. And of course, Tech's work in the 60s predates the HIV/AIDS crisis, but it's hard to not see it through that lens now. And so I was just curious to know, like, was that an artist you were thinking about, but also like, was that a history that you were thinking about, and sort of, you know, beyond this specific historical series of events that you're talking about, what other concerns did you have?
Yeah. I was introduced to Paul Tech's work in grad school through a studio visit. And one of the things that was really interesting to me was his use of materials. You know, sometimes it was plaster that's covered in wax and also paint. And I think whenever you start working with sculpture, you have to consider the temporality of the material itself. And so I started to understand more why all of his sculptures were placed in plexiglass boxes, is to protect it from the elements, and also to protect it from hands. During this exhibition, I learned that people are very handsy, and if you give them a hole where material is exposed, they will touch. A lot of people were talking about, you know, wanting to bite the silicone. And so, you know, it just like starts to bring out the perverseness of the audience. And so, you know, when you think about like the history of like what certain sculptors and painters do, there's like a reason or functionality to it, because, you know, we all have the same concerns of like, how do we protect this work as much as possible, not only like materially, but conceptually.
I'm kind of surprised someone wanted to, because I think to me, one of the things that I find like fascinating about your work is like the solicitation of disgust in some of the pieces. Like not all of them, but like this one in particular. I'm like, so I'm intrigued that someone wanted to like ingest it.
Well, I mean, when you look at some of the layers in these pieces, it starts to look like, you know, stuff at a bakery. Like the chunks of fat, I actually got the idea from going to this baker's supply in New York that had just chunks of pineapples that you would like pump inside donuts. And then, you know, there's also like the pink. And one of the reasons why I was also attracted to silicone was, you know, its association with sex toys. And so I think the squishiness or the associations that we have with pleasure, or like, you know, putting them in holes or whatever, it's like, oh, well, I can understand now. Or like even chew toys. I can see why people would like, you know, subconsciously want to do things to this specific material, because it's found in so many other things that they are allowed to interact with in that way.
Yeah. It still just feels so hard, because it's like a commentary on the consumption of Black flesh, and then people want, you know, and then people want to also consume it.
Oh yeah, no, it's weird. It's fucked up.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm in similar conversations in my practice, so my brain is like swirling at 1,000. trying to think of a centralized thing for this moment. So you think about, and please tell me if I'm wrong, obviously, you're thinking about this man and his trash self. You're thinking about all of that, right? All of that 19th century history. I'm also very much there in my work. Deirdre Cooper Owens' work. I don't know if y'all have read into this. Like when you say grotesque, it's too heavy to hold. So it's always great to see other Black folks directly in this conversation and creating, obviously, and really grappling and bringing it out how we see fit and correct and ethical. The show is fantastic. Something I don't do in my work, and I'm not qualifying at all, I think it's very curious and very generative. So in your practice, you're thinking about these things, 19th century medicine, right? And all of these systemic violences. So if we're thinking about the Black female body, or as I suppose you're thinking about the Black female body and the reality of how the Black female body is continuously ungendered, made to be something that isn't even human, isn't even woman, is made to be object and subject in a hospital setting. How do you, like in your practice, as you're actually doing the making, in those moments in your studio or whatever space, the name of that space makes sense to you? So how are you, like, literally, I'm thinking about the actual process. Like we can erase the whole grad school thing, we've done that, we're amazing. But like literally like being in it, right? Like right. Actually like you're making it, whatever that process, like how do you, if you do it all, how do you carry sexuality into that? Like, for example, for the piece that we're looking at right now, are you thinking about that, like in a consensual, sexy way, or is that not even really in your mind as you are putting, for the sake of this moment, that piece together? Or I guess in your larger practice, how does that come in terms of the Black female body and being in conversation about gynecology and how that came to be, and enslaved Black women being forced to be experimented on and being forced to assist this man in his experiments. I hope that made sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely consider J. Marion Sims to be a sadist. And I think especially with a lot of physicians, they have personal interests or fetishes or kinks that end up folding well into their profession. And so I don't necessarily believe that his concern was always to serve the body, but to be able to cut and torture and do whatever he wants with like the medical industry co-signing him. Yeah, this work is almost 10 years old. And since then, I have changed the palette of my work. So now I don't work with chopped up or dismembered Black skin. It started to register very differently for me, I would say in 2020, where, you know, we experienced a lot of brutalized Black bodies in the media. And so I didn't want to continue to add to that. And also in my studio, I did start to feel like sensitive about what I could do with the material, because I felt more emotionally connected to it because it reflected what I looked like. And so I wasn't able to feel free as an artist and do what I want. So I started working with white skin, with white flesh instead. And so my focus now is more about like revenge and, you know, how can I be a sadist in my own studio? So that has helped out a lot. And I feel like that's probably a good way to segue over to this piece. This piece is called Fuck Baloney. To give a little bit of history, myself and Kenya Robinson, we did a 2-person show at Pioneer Works in 2017 called White Man on a Pedestal. And all of my pieces focused on J. Marion Sims. One of the pieces that I also did was take a 3D scan of his statue while it was still up. We did a foam printing of the statue, and then I covered it in silicone and peeled the skin off. And then we did a surgery, a vesicovaginal fistula repair surgery in front of an audience, hinting to the Gross Clinic, the Thomas Eakins painting. And so it was myself and 6 other Black femmes. And it was really amazing to be in a position where an audience was looking or watching Black femmes cut apart this body. And, you know, there's whiskey everywhere and blood, and, you know, everybody kind of like has their hands in different parts of the process or the procedure. So that was one instance where we switched it and declared that J. Marion Sims as a figure is no longer safe. So that was one piece that we did. In 2019, or right after the show came down, they actually decided to remove the statue from Central Park. So that was a really big moment for me because I felt like, oh my God, like, you know, my work and my intentions, in addition to everyone else that was protesting and doing petitions, actually, you know, caused some change. And so it kind of made creating art feel very different for me, and very powerful. And so after his statue came down, they were like, yeah, we're moving his statue to his grave site, which is Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. And so I went to his grave thinking that, you know, his statue was going to be there, and it wasn't there. And so one thing that I started doing was I started collecting my urine in 40 bottles, and so I'll go to his grave on the same day that he died, and I would pour one out for him. You know, and and that was really amazing. And so it's like, oh well, you know, like I can take the, you know, the first step of like, you know, referencing the Black body in the history, but also like take it to another level. And so so I would do that every year. And then with this piece, I was actually thinking about ways that I could use the material that was present there. So I sculpted a bust of his head, like a clay sculpture, and took a mold of it. I went to his grave and dug up some of his grave dirt, and then mixed that with this pink silicone, poured it into the head, so there's like a silicone version of his head. And then I bought a deli meat slicer, and then I sliced his face and ended up being able to create this large piece of bologna. And so when you come up closer, you can see there's like particles of dirt and grass. And it also just like makes me think about materials in a very different way. Especially thinking about like ashes or bone or people's hair and like materials that typically get used in like witchcraft, but also like how can we use those same materials, or like how can witchcraft be transformed into an art practice? And you know, it just like also continues the type of assault that can happen. Beyond this work, there's also beyond this work, there is also a piece that I did at the New Museum, where we took that same silicone body that we did the surgery on, and I turned it into a punching bag and hung that up and invited Black femmes to assault the body. So, you know, there was a day where we came in and we all had whips and paddles, and we just beat the shit out of this punching bag that was made of his flesh. So that's how I take it and change it. And so, yeah, I don't have to feel as sensitive about the ways that I cut through skin anymore, because it feels more intentional to do it to something that represents this person rather than further victimize people that, you know, were already tortured. Done.
Yeah. I feel like there are a lot of different avenues. I mean, I think one of the things I want us to talk about maybe is like the way the texture of this disgust is so different. Like, do people want to eat that?
I don't know. I know that I don't, because I actually hate bologna. So, okay. and that comes into the concepts too, but I haven't really gotten a lot of feedback where people were talking about wanting to eat this thing. Or
yeah. Or like, I mean, it's like it's gross. Mm-hmm. It's gross. So, I mean, I think I'm just thinking about sort of like the way disgust can be mobilized in so many different ways, or is mobilized in so many different ways through your work. I'm also interested. I was really interested when you were talking about witchcraft. Are you still? What is that?
Am I a witch? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah. Or is that? Where else is that coming up?
Right. Well, I will say that witches get a bad rep. There is a lot of power in being intentional with materials that have energy. I think that people need to broaden their ideas of what witchcraft looks like. The most powerful form of witchcraft is blood sacrifice, and white people have been practicing blood sacrifice for a long time. And that is kind of like an immediate track to power. And so when you think about what's going on right now and the genocide that's happening, not only in Gaza, but also in other places, that, yeah. Am I doing things to combat that in my own personal practice? Yes.
Yeah. That's very hard to pivot from. No, I mean, I think I'm also struck by, in some ways, like the absence of viscera here, and sort of like thinking about that with regard to like bloodshed, blood sacrifice, and sort of like what it means to not have, because I think what makes that piece we're sort of slowly segueing to so powerful is kind of like the withholding, that you can get the sense that there is like something inside. Because I feel like there's the acting of revenge, and then there's also like a protection. Yeah. Which. Yeah,
well, I think there's also like a new type of power in working with abstraction. Typically, you know, I think that when we think of who owns abstraction, it's a very like specific group of people, and so I wanted to figure out ways that I could work a little bit less descriptive, but still have a significance in material that stands in for the blood and the guts.
Yeah. Do people have questions about fuck baloney before we move over?
I just want to say that, do you paint as well? Sorry if that question is real rude. If you do, sorry.
Technically, well, I used to paint with paint, but okay. The silicone, it's translucent when it's out of the bucket. So I am painting, mixing these colors together and like applying it to surfaces, or, you know, stitching it together. So technically, yes.
Okay. Yeah, I was just curious mainly because you made that comment about abstraction. Abstraction is just so powerful. And there are so many Black painters who are, fantastically in conceptual abstraction. And I don't paint. I generally work with paper and photography. So I just want to say I'm glad to see abstraction in all of its magical forms. Sorry to be talking a lot. I'm just a practicing artist.
Don't apologize.
This is a point of view tour for everybody. Everybody's point of view is welcome. We're here for this. Other.
Yeah, thanks for your work. And I was just struck when we were there and you named Anarcha to then see the banner that had Anarcha's name. And I was curious just to hear about how you think about those women in the practice. And it sounds like maybe you've moved away from questions of representation in regards to them, but how are they figuring, if at all, even in your thinking?
Right. Well, I think it's definitely transformed, especially when I was talking about having Black femmes come in and like physically assault the work. It offers a space for them to be present in a very different way. I would say especially the performance that we did at the New Museum, it was really physically taxing to be like whipping a thing. And there was definitely like a lot of spiritual tension in the space. The site of the New Museum is above the second official African American burial ground in New York. And so it has a lot of significance. And like, I have no doubt in my mind that there was a larger audience there that we couldn't see, but could very much feel. And also some of the materials that I used for the piece, like there were cowrie shells throughout the room, but also raffia, which is typically a material used to like invite the spirit. So I fully believe that the way that I'm working now, it leaves a space for a lot more work to be done than just focusing on like the tragedy, but ways that like the tragedy can be transformed into, I guess, more catharsis.
Yeah, I mean, it's also making me think about, there's so many different people who look in that mirror, right? So there's one way of being complicit, but there's another way of also imagining yourself as part of a lineage, right? And sort of spiritual and all these other types of ways. Okay, let's go over there. So this is after her tomb. And I'm just going to say, though, so I've written a little bit about King Cobra, and the first things I started writing about were things from this show, and what compelled me was how beautiful they are. So I've been talking a little bit about disgust, but here I feel like we're getting a really, really different affect. And obviously I want to hear everything you have to say about the show, but I just wanted to sort of signal the tonal change, and sort of like I love the tension within it, and the closeness, like the sense of interiority is like really strong.
Yeah, this piece is really special. In 2019, I did a show, She Is Risen, at JTT. It was my first solo show in New York. And a lot of times what happens with my work is that I overproduce skins and materials, and they usually end up kind of like sitting in a bin, which is also very perverse because it just looks like I have, a lot of like guts in my studio. And so with this work, I wanted to figure out ways that I could use some of those materials to create new works. And this piece, After Her Tomb, this pink section, it's really nice. I would typically pour out pink silicone and then use a heat gun and slowly like gather the material as it would solidify, so it creates this natural wrinkling of skin. And that ended up being used in a piece in that solo show to create these calla lilies that laid inside of a casket, like a pink velvet lined casket. And so I wanted to figure out ways that I could use that specific material from that piece. And that show happened just a few months before this show, The Remains. And so, yeah, I basically wanted to figure out ways to like draw connections between different works, or like also establish a visual language for myself. And so that's how this piece was created.
Do you want to talk about the pearls?
The pearls.
Because they're beautiful. I mean, it's just, I think what's like, it feels luxurious. And in the context of like Black bodies or Black people who have been objectified and cut up in all these ways, like it really, like it feels very nice. Like to me, this, I know it's not leather, but it feels leather.
Yeah.
Like it's luxe.
Yeah. And that was really cool because I ended up using the same molds that I used for the White Man on a Pedestal show. There's a piece called Rack of the Ravaged and Unconsenting. And this was the first time that I had used just straight up black silicone. And so I put the silicone inside those body molds. And when I stitched it together, it did start to become more abstract. And I think that's kind of like how I ended up starting to like work a little bit less with representational tones, but also just like implied ideas. And I also started working with the expandable foam. And I'm giving away all my secrets. I started working with expandable foam and plastic tarps, so I was able to pour and like shape it as it was expanding and hardening, which ended up having more of like body folds, or like a puffer jacket effect. And so that also helped me to become a little bit more abstract with materials. And then naturally, like as I gathered it in the center, it makes a hole. And there's a lot of holes in my work, let's be honest. And you know, naturally, I think like I just love to decorate, and so it felt good or also appropriate to kind of like adorn this hole in this way, because it also references like, you know, discharge or bodily fluids that might come out of a hole. Yeah. And the owner is here.
Now you have new things to think about. Yeah. That was definitely not where I thought you were going to go either. But
well, it also like, it starts to hint at like a BDSM aesthetic, which is a little bit more clean.
I mean, and I think one of the, like, with the title, one of the references is sort of, for me, this piece plays off of the banners. Because it also, now I can't get the discharge out of my head, but I was really thinking, it feels like a lot of like about survival. It's sort of like you are sewn back together and maybe still vulnerable, and I guess maybe still, you know, leaking, but like going on.
Okay, you just led right into what I wanted to ask. That's why I had to ask it right now. So, okay, first an observation and then a question. I promise I'll keep it quick. Just thinking about abstraction and the fact that you are on the East Coast and sort of steeped in American abstraction. And certainly when I saw this piece, I thought about Lee Bonteque, not because I need to compare your work to a bunch of white artists, but because I think her work is actually really interesting in the context of abstract expressionism, because it's sculpture that acts like painting. And also because it always has like these mean metal teeth in it somewhere. You know, and so this is very seductive and very inviting, but there's also like, there's a little bit of that like tension as well with the staples. And so I wanted to ask you about, I guess what I really want to ask you is not so much about like the implication of the vagina dentata, although I think it's there in like a kind of a romantic way, but actually I want to ask you what you think about Frankenstein. because you were talking about having like chests full of skin and stuff, you know, and I was like, oh, right, because Frankenstein is also like, there was this great article in the New Yorker a few years ago about how Mary Shelley had all these miscarriages and stillbirths, and like, you know, her mother, who was a famous feminist, died in childbirth, so there was this kind of like, there's this feminist Frankenstein thing that's happening, and I just wonder if you have any thoughts about that, basically.
Right. Well, I think some of those qualities started to come out just as I started producing more work, and had more materials to work with as they were like accumulating, you know, as being cut off from these other sculptures. But I haven't really thought about it too much. It just like naturally happens. That's really interesting. I feel like I'm processing it in real time. Oh, yeah. Well, okay. So right now I'm actually pivoting to TV and film. And so it has me, it leaves a portal for me to have a lot more fun. And I think the way that I've been approaching materials here, like stitching and bringing concepts together, definitely makes sense within that realm. And I think, yes, I am a mad scientist, among many other things. And I think like a lot of the contradictions that just like exist within my life make my work make more sense. But yes, and. I want to know what you thought of the piece before you wrote, like before you purchased. What did you think aesthetically? What attracted you to the work?
I actually, she was actually spot on my analysis. I hate to say it, but I saw a lot of older feminine sculptors in the work, and it was very seductive. And you know, as a heterosexual guy looking at it, it's like, boy, that's a beautiful image. And then you get in and you're like, oh my God, right? You see the staples and all that, and you're like, oh, that's not what I was thinking at all. So to me, there's a lot of sort of danger in there.
Yeah. There is a lot of danger. In another piece that was in that same show, it also had a hole, but I stuck pins through the back. So now I start to set traps for people so that they can't touch it, or if they do, like they will be physically harmed. And this is actually one that doesn't have pins, so it's a nice observation.
I actually, in my mind, think about it as having razor blades inside because of other pieces. Yeah. And this one actually doesn't, but they blend together from that perspective.
Yeah, I don't know if you guys have seen some of the more figurative work that Cobra has made in the past. There's some really incredible stuff that they've done with the pearls as intestines and hands and limbs coming out, and there's like a lot of association with, you know, the darker histories of the ocean and the climate and such. Maybe we didn't talk about the climate so much. Maybe we can talk about that now? I don't know.
No, I mean, I think I'm into the mad scientist Frankenstein segue, because I think one of the pieces that Cobra and I were talking about before is this piece by Sandra Ibarra. I want to hear your reflections on it, and then I can...
Yeah, I mean, I definitely reacted to this work as soon as I walked in. Not only because of the piercings, which actually working at a piercing shop, that was my first official job, working at Infinite Body Piercing in Philadelphia. Not doing piercings, but filling out paperwork and stuff. But I naturally have like a deep interest in body modification. I'm also a tattoo artist, an aspiring scarification artist. But I also was really Moved because my sister was physically disabled for 11 years, and I had a lot of interaction with a wheelchair, and so it kind of like brought back some old memories for me. Just thinking about taking it apart and putting it back together to get it in the car. So that was just like, you know, a more personal connection that I had with the work. But I definitely also see elements of, you know, BDSM and like gear and instruments used to press the pain.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's also, I feel like it's a piece that also foregrounds fabrication in particular way, like in a similar way as yours, right? Like you can really tell that Sandra is like really working with like, I'm like, I don't even know what metal, whatever that metal, like there was a similar type of physicality, I feel like, that I see in your work. I'm also seeing in this piece. And yeah, I don't know if you'd, but I think also in terms of the thinking with the themes of the show, it's also really, I feel like this quality, when I see this, I feel like I'm seeing like a patient rebelling and sort of like engaging in sexuality despite the constraint of sort of being part of this apparatus that would otherwise want to write it out of the picture. And so, I don't know. I mean, definitely that's BDSM, but I think it's beyond that. To me, it's really a lot about like an unruly body, sort of like this this move towards autonomy that feels like really important, and it's kind of like a big thematic, I think, throughout the rest of the show.
Yeah, I think there's also like a lot of medical associations with like skin paired with very shiny, clean steel. I know, were we talking about the speculum?
Yeah,
Yeah.
a little bit, yeah.
Yeah. But some of these components also make me think about that too. And I guess this overarching idea of like the pelvic exam or the...
Yes. We can go to see now's, I know, sorry, it's like, this is all improvised, so we're, but I guess maybe before, if other people have other reflections about Ibarra's piece. I mean, I think one of the things that's also so striking is how large it is. Having spent a lot of time like as a medical patient, I'm sort of like, yes, this is the size that medicine can take up in your life when you are undergoing things. Like, it is not a tiny thing. It is like everything, and you are dwarfed and, you know, fragmented in all these ways.
I kind of like what you were saying. A lot of my work I'm thinking about, this person is differently abled, this artist, correct? Oh, no. So, but this, okay, thank you. Thank you for that clarification. So a lot of my work, I am thinking about illness and being differently abled and movement, cartography, kinetics, and how you kind of just said how you use the word dwarfed, and then I'm thinking about the reality of being in a chair, which can be like being a type of being constrained, and how this artist kind of pulled out and took up that space. I think that's really generative, and really it's intriguing, and it's generative, and I think it's successful, if that's, yeah.
Thank you. I'm thinking about the news article recently of how airlines are fined for their workers just trashing people's wheelchair, and places that don't allow wheelchair to enter, even the wheelchair are like extension of their body. And this piece, like you were talking about the physical space, also makes me think about sometimes how ableists are angry about how much space people with wheelchair takes up. And yeah.
Maybe I'll just say something quickly more about this work. This is from a larger series that Sandra Ibarri made that was in conversation with Bob Flanagan and Sheree Rose's archive, which is the One Archives here in Los Angeles. And they were in a 24-hour dominant submissive relationship. Bob had cystic fibrosis, and they made a lot of performances, often in nightclubs, very kind of intense stuff. And so kind of similar, Cobra, to how you work, kind of thinking about bringing other people there, although Bob is no longer alive. When Sandra was in the studio, she had a photo of Bob and was kind of communing with him. And the pieces that are the chest, that are the leather, she kind of bruised very lovingly, kind of thought about that relationship and that set of performance practices. She's an artist, but she's also an activist who does a lot of work around decriminalization and sex work and decarceral feminism. And she fabricated this all by hand. She learned how to do metal fabrication, and then she did the piercings herself of the leather. And very much, as you said, she was thinking about kind of taking up space and this kind of very sprawling work, which we often are kind of tripping around and thinking about, how to move in space and be confined or be allowed to take up space. And then, as you were saying, there's the kind of relationship between the leather and the metal is between the body, and its assistive devices becomes very knotted, and difficult to separate. And Sandra has made another work that's around the corner, the menstrual Rorschach test, that we could look at, but kind of thinking to Cobra's work, a lot of the works in the exhibition, and also Penteha Abrashi is another artist in that room who's kind of thinking in the space of like the erotic and the clinical and that kind of surging violence and kind of power that is kind of very much present at the surface. And I also just wanted to name Colleen Smith, who made the banners that have been referenced many times, this incredible set of banners that she made directly in relationship really to the exhibition and through her own research practice, and is here. Not to put on the spot, but if Colleen wants to say anything. Yeah, please.
Hi, Cobra. I have a question for you about materials and also about a particular kind of touch with the materials. I really love the materiality of your work, and it's been there from the very early work toward the more abstract. But I think I see in the touch a kind of liberatory gesture that I don't see in the early work that I see here, and I love that, of course. And you've even described your journey there. But I was wondering if you could talk about materials also in relationship to precision, which you seem to be in a certain regard. And I may be misquoting you, but I read something where you said that, like when you make a tattoo on someone, you cannot mess up. And you often see artwork that looks sort of almost provisional, like unconsidered marks or touches. And I was wondering if you could talk about that, especially in relationship to these works, which I think I wouldn't call them unconsidered marks or touches at all, but I would say that it seems discursive with the material, like you're responding and pushing and pulling with it.
Yeah, that's a great question, because I feel like there's definitely a balance that needs to happen with leaving some things unfinished or allowing the material to do its thing and like working with it rather than trying to focus so much energy on controlling it. I think with my neurodiversities, my ADHD, my autism, that when it comes to finishing an edge or filling in space or perfectly adorning a section of a work, that I do get obsessive with that. And I think there is also a grotesqueness with the ways that people adorn things. I think placing like a few pearls versus like 100 in one section, it starts to like transform into something very different. And I think that is, a constant psychological battle of like, when am I doing too much? When do I have to stop myself? And also like, in some ways, I do wish that I could be a plastic surgeon. And I also recognize that, I'm not great at taking tests, or I do get stressed out, or I do have panic attacks. So I don't think like I would be really great in a situation where I was working with someone's live body that I have to keep alive. But I am able to do those things in some of the work. And so when I'm working with skin or flesh and making like perfect cuts where they have to meet together, it starts to satisfy that urge that I have to work, you know, in the medical field, but also without the pressure of, you know, having to consider someone else's appearance or ability to like move about the world. I also get really disappointed when I approach work that doesn't have great craftsmanship. And so I end up punishing myself and like, you know, overly make sure that everything is finished because I know how hard I am as an audience member, and that, you know, I also have to think about people that are like me that also are like judging the craftsmanship of work very critically, and so that's what I do. I try to make sure that everyone's satisfied, but mostly myself. Was that weird?
Other questions, comments? I mean, we can. Do you want to move to the pelvic exam?
Sure.
I mean, yeah.
I just wanted to mention that, like, my favorite thing, I'm going to paraphrase, that Bob Flanagan ever said was that he said because of his cystic fibrosis that he was in pain all of the time. Pain was an experience that he had constantly and chronically, and so his decision to engage in BDSM practices was a way of having some control or some power over pain, which is something that he didn't choose to have. But he couldn't choose to have less of it, but he could choose to have more of it, is the way I understand it. And so I felt like I had to say that when we were talking about this work, because I think there are a lot of ways to read it in the 21st century that are valid and real and present. And I also think that understanding who Bob Flanagan was in the early 1990s, he was a very different kind of person than you might think looking at this, and maybe also the same kind of person, I don't know. But I just really love that idea of, like, sometimes we can't take the pain away, but we can actually choose to go further into it as a way of exerting our own control, but also then being able to control when it stops. And that could be physical pain, but it could also be historical pain.
Yeah, no, thank you for, yeah, I was just thinking before you said it, I was like, yes, it's this question of history and legacy and sort of, well, and the witchy transformations that you've talked about. All right, should we let us, it's kind of an awkward, or, yeah.
So I think we have like around 10 minutes just to give us an idea, and we should go and look at the pelvic floor exercises. But I want to say one other thing about how works are in conversation that might generate some kind of ideas for people, because as you can see, artists like Cobra have works that are kind of spread out, and we thought a lot about the placement and how the works connect, and thinking about how these kind of intersectional histories are not disconnected, though they're often siloed into different forms of thinking. And when you are looking at this work here, and I don't know if people got a chance to really get up close, and I want everyone to do that, you can actually, you see your reflection, and I love, Amber, how you put that as a question of complicity or kind of legacy. And you see behind you Andrea Carlson's Sunshine on a Cannibal that really speaks to the kind of idea of the settler colonial as the cannibal, and not the other way around. And so do you want to say something?
Yeah, no, there's a really great interview in the catalog with between the artist and Michelle Rehajo, who's a colleague of mine at Riverside, and they talk about Columbus and Other Cannibals, really key text in indigenous theory, which is about the disease of rapacious greed, in which it is the settler colonial's disease. So anyway, it's just it's a really amazing work, and there's a couple things in the piece. There's a lot of iconography there, and a lot of it's got its own bibliography. But one of the most kind of jaw-dropping stories there is repeated across it are these blue figures, which are references to Yves Klein's anthropometries. I always forget the name, but the infamous performance action in which he had women dip themselves in blue paint and make a work by pressing their bodies against a canvas. And he did one of these performances for camera for the makers of Mondo Cane, a shockumentary, not understanding really the framework within which this was going to be presented, which was in essence a shockumentary that plays with imperialist fantasy tropes, but also like makes these kinds of juxtapositions between this scenes of cannibals, meaning cannibals, the colonist nightmare figure of the indigenous other gets kind of cut into scenes of the voracious brutality of capitalism, right? So it's disorientating work, and then in that is you actually see Yves Klein doing this performance, and when he saw it in the movie theater, he was so shocked by. He was so disorientated by how his practice, which is so obviously sexist and scandalous and sensationalist, really, for him it was totally shocking to see it represented that way, and he had a heart attack in the theater. And the story is that actually led directly to his death eventually. And so there's a text in the middle which is insert trigger warning here, and that's one of the many stories embedded in that work. But on the way, I can actually make a quick connection between Fuck Baloney and Dottie Addie's Disturbing Rumors. Cobra was talking a little bit about, reference quickly, Thomas Eakins. Cobra lives in Philadelphia, and Thomas Eakins is a massive and massively problematic art historical figure, painter, 19th century painter. And the hand in the middle of this is the hand of Samuel Gross, who's the subject of a portrait called The Gross Clinic. And that's this bloody hand holding the scalpel. I have a personal kind of attachment to that painting because I started writing about that. It was one of the things that kind of made me a scholar. I was kind of hailed by that painting, and also how it's got like really intense, crazy gender story because it's the body on the table. It's presented like, butt first. And so it's you can't see the face, the head, nothing. You only see the ass and the thigh, and everything's foreshortened. And then there's this very vaginal cut on the thigh, and that all these men are like leaning into it and they're peeling it open and like looking inside and digging around in it. And then there's this like woman in the background, kind of shrinking away in horror, and she's supposed to be the patient's chaperone. And then underneath that hand is text that says disturbing rumors. I mean, there's so much going on in this work, but just in there, disturbing rumors could refer to stories about him being gay, stories rooted in his sexual romantic relationships with men that were of lifelong importance to him, but also to the sexual abuse of people in his life, including a niece who shot herself with a gun he gave her. And there's a lot of connections between this and Fuck Baloney and J. Marion Sims and the mad scientist and the clinical and the sadist, right? Because one of the stories, when you look into the stories around his abusive conduct, the framework for it was that he was like a realist, right? He's a realist painter and he's seeking accuracy, and he's very clinical in his demeanor in relationship to other bodies. And so the accounts that we have access to of people who accused him of abusing them described him as actually being really cold and distancing as he was molesting them. So those are like kind of the undercurrent of parts of these stories, or the ways in which these scenes of abuse are kind of like never too far away from us. And in art history, like Thomas Eakins was lauded as a maverick and as like the paradigmatic American painter. And to produce that narrative, you basically had to completely dismiss stories that are right there on the historical surface. And it's still, I'd say, fairly controversial to talk about Thomas Eakins that way, so especially in Philly. So anyway, there's just a kind of amazing connection that, because you reference that in that painting, in that performance on, yeah, anyway, sorry, I'm stumbling over myself because Cobra's right here.
And before we go to now, I just want to sort of quickly flag that this image, the broader image behind, that's the sort of like visual language for the gynecological image. So you can see that there's no head, it's just a torso, not even limbs. So it's just sort of like this idea of an accessible, an accessible female body with spread legs, who sort of really, that being the focal point of what is happening. But that's sort of an image that repeats over and over and over again. And I think it's really striking that in the pieces that we've talked about, even though we've been talking about sexuality, we have not been so explicitly genitally focused, right? And it's not coincidental that this image also has echo or resonance with pornographic images, right? So people sort of talk about the way the pornographic and the scientific kind of coincide at this particular moment. But I want to keep that in mind as we go to now's presentation, just because you'll see such a different visual language around the gynecological. In my essay, in contrast to the type of imagery that we just looked at, precisely, I'm particularly interested in the fact that we hear Nao's voice, and sort of like the importance of thinking about like we're hearing like people's subjectivity and that we see her face, and just sort of thinking also about questions of comfort, which maybe you have noticed have not appeared throughout a lot of what we've been talking about.
Nao's been making this cycle of work called Bloom, and this is on view at track 16. I mentioned that in the very top. So this is an element from Bloom, and it's called vaginasium. Yep, I always want to call it vaginarium, but it's vaginasium. The artist is on the monitor leading the participant who's laying on the couch and listening to Nao via a speaker that's tucked into the pillows. So you can listen to Nao as she leads you through pelvic floor strengthening exercises. This is where I'm going to face you a little bit, just because I always love explaining about the pelvic floor. Pelvic floor muscles, it's the only muscle complex in the standing body that's horizontal. So when you're standing up, your muscle complexes are vertical, with the exception of the pelvic floor, which gives you a sense of physical integrity, meaning it helps you to hold your insides inside. It's a site of, as people age, they experience a lot of weakness, and there's so much taboo, though, in the treatment of the pelvic floor that a lot of people will seek out like surgical intervention before they will seek out pelvic floor physiotherapy, which on a medical level is actually the least invasive treatment for pelvic floor difficulties. But that does mean a therapist touching you and going inside you. I've been kind of obsessed with pelvic floor physiotherapy, partly because it's as a form of physical therapy. It's hard for people to ask for it. We probably all know people who could use it. Older people who suffer from incontinence, for example, pelvic floor physiotherapy is really helpful for that, helpful for painful intercourse, for all kinds of things. It's the form of physical therapy training that involves a very high level degree of awareness of consent, right? That there's a whole consent practice in the professional practice of pelvic floor physiotherapy, and it's like an active and ongoing solicitation of consent. So it's a form of body work. I mean, as is true for a lot of body work and sex work, obviously, there's a really intense awareness about consent and consent practices that's woven deeply into the practice. We'll be having a pelvic floor physiotherapist here. Oh my gosh, I've forgotten the date. It's December 9th, somewhere around there. It's a Saturday in December, and this is Al Schulte, and Al founded the Pelvic Sanctuary. And so it's a gender-inclusive pelvic floor health workshop.
And we're also doing a workshop with Now that's a make your own speculum workshop with clay. which will be really incredible. Maybe I can just say a few other things about this because it's a work that you can touch and you can lay on, and now found this incredible couch at a thrift store, but then perfectly had it covered in this plastic. But if you get up close, there's gold piping. It's a very kind of attention to detail kind of thing, and the like crispy plastic feeling when you lay down on it. And she's leading us, like Jennifer said, in this pelvic floor exercise, and she kind of takes on the figure of a sort of healer in the space. And we're talking about abstraction and figuration, and there aren't really kind of a lot of real people, in this exhibition. And she, is not just a real person in life, but here we see her. Sorry. And also another kind of, besides gynecology and the history of gynecology, the story of psychoanalysis is a really important thread throughout the exhibition, and so kind of the analyst couch. And then this invitation to please lie down, I think, is a really important one to think about in terms of consent, which also comes up a lot in the exhibition. Patrick Staff's 16mm film on the other side, you have to ask for it to be turned on to see. So there's a lot of questions around consent that come up.
No. I mean, I don't have more to add, really. No, but just for me, it's really striking the invitation into a co-being with, right, as opposed to these histories of violence where somebody is subjected to something. You're being invited to participate in a gentle, comfortable way.
There are hard juxtapositions throughout the show, and I just want to sort of point to the relationship between Penteja Abareshi's work and now Bustamante's work, that this is one place where we're like, is this too much to have these really hard gear shifts from this very welcoming and inviting and participatory piece into the work of Penteja Abareshi, which is closely related to chest rest in its points of references, but also has lots of sharp edges, and it's not a place where necessarily I think maybe people feel, I don't know if safe's the right word, so it has a completely different kind of tone to it. Yeah, so, and I can say that.
Why don't we thank Cobra and Amber for an incredible walkthrough. I think it's so rare to get to hear an artist talk about their practice, and it's such a gift, and we're so appreciative. And thank you also to everyone who participated and came and brought your questions and your observations. And please come back again for another program. Thank you.